Daniel, I want to start by talking about your involvement in chamber music generally, because looking at your CV, it seems like chamber music chose you or you chose it. It seems to be your major musical involvement. Would that be correct?
It is something that I found myself doing more and more over the past decade and a half, really. Um, as a kid and as a student, I always had my focus set very much on being a concert pianist, playing solo recitals, playing concertos. But I think, it's fair to say that it finds you, or that it found me, in the sense that the reality of being a concert musician these days is that you collaborate with others. And whilst as a pianist you do spend a lot of time on your own, practicing on your own, and you're self-sufficient, as a pianist we have, this wonderful repertoire that we don't need anyone else to play with. Nonetheless, I find, particularly since I've returned to Australia about 10 years ago, that the musical landscape is very much based around chamber music. So it's been a very happy meeting place for me, really, something that I feel I'm very much attuned to, and something that is in line with my musical ethos, if you like.
You still get to do other sorts of music making. I mean, I know I've seen you recently do concerto performances. Do you get to do solo recitals much?
I do. They're less common in Australia, I found, than other places where I've lived. So opportunities are harder to come by. And of course, preparing a solo recital program, which is traditionally played from memory, and often involves enormously virtuosic parts and feats, which, when you're a student, that's what you spend your time doing day in, day out, and then life happens, and that kind of thing becomes more daunting, I guess. So I do go out of my way to play solo every year. And part of my motivation for that is that I'm now on staff at the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University in Brisbane. And I think it's really important for our students to see us, their teachers, on the stage. So I play chamber music, obviously a lot at the con, collaborate with visiting artists and with the other faculty members. But I also make a point of playing a solo recital each year as well. And once you're doing that, once you're getting a program up, of course, it's nice to get a little bit of mileage out of it. So I do try to play a few times each year, but the bulk of what I do these days does revolve around collaborations, a lot of duo work, and then festivals such as the one in Bendigo.
And of course, solo recitals, they say being a pianist is lonely, and I guess what you say is true, that there is so much solo repertoire, but at least playing chamber music, you get that social element, which is so enjoyable about playing chamber music for anybody.
It is. And we're talking about them as though they're different beasts, which musically I don't really feel that they are that much. There is this conception of or perception of pianists as either soloists or collaborators. In reality, it's very, very rarely the case. But even when we're playing on our own, we're intertwining musical lines, musical ideas. We might be playing with the scope of an orchestra at one instrument, but from a musical conception standpoint, I think the difference is not enormous. But socially, as you say, yes, it is quite different, and it's really lovely to share the stage with people. And the rehearsal process is something that's very, very special, unique, and almost more enjoyable, I have to say, than the performances. Just that sharing of ideas when the pressure's off, and you're just really having the conversation with people in music. It is a very, very special thing.
Now, what you say is really interesting, that music is music, and from the audience's point of view, we might tend to see them as different beasts. But so I suppose then my next question is: I remember seeing you play such varied repertoire in the 2020 Chamber Music Festival in Bendigo, and I particularly remember a recital you did with Andrew Goodwin, and so that's something that you're doing also with Jacqueline Porter in the next festival, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I wonder I think that when you work with a singer, you have another level of responsibility too, because we tend to think of the pianist as being an accompanist, and I think this is possibly a touchy point with pianists sometimes, because we tend to forget that, particularly in lieder, but in vocal accompaniment generally, you are absolutely the equal of the singer, and you have to be as aware of the texts and the translations as much as the singer is. That'd be true, yes?
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the word accompanist is one that rubs many pianists up the wrong way.
I'm sure. I heard associate artist as an alternative term, but
yes, associate artist, collaborative pianist. There are a lot of somewhat awkward ways of trying to say pianist.
Yes, well, yes.
Because you never hear of, say, the violinist in a violin and piano sonata program. You never hear the violinist referred to as the pianist's accompanist.
Very true. Yeah.
Seems to be a one-way street, and there is, of course, with singers even more so, this aura around singers as the diva, as the star of the show, and they're standing up the front, and they're the ones making eye contact, and literally speaking words to an audience. And of course, everyone sitting in that hall has a voice of their own, and so can, to some extent, relate to what that person is doing. We all like to sing in the shower, whereas there's often a lot more mystique about an instrumentalist for anyone who hasn't played a musical instrument. So there are reasons for it, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, we carry, more often than not, we carry 90% of the material just by virtue of what the piano is, what it's capable of.
I think that also in this particular festival, one thing that strikes me is the extraordinary variety of things that you're doing. I mean, just looking through the program, there are works here that we don't hear very often, which I think is one of the great things about a festival. For example, the Mendelssohn Third Piano Quartet. I can't recall ever hearing any of the Mendelssohn quartets for a long while, and certainly not live. So my question here is, you, I would imagine, would be playing some of this music for the first time in a situation like that?
Yes. The Mendelssohn B minor piano quartet, thankfully, is something that I've played before, and I say that because it is one of the most fiendishly virtuosic things ever written.
Oh, really?
It's one of those, yeah. Mendelssohn's known for his virtuosic writing, of course, and for his virtuosic playing.
Yes.
And precociousness as a composer and as a youthful, as a prodigy. And his piano quartets are actually opus 1, 2, and 3. So his first mature works.
I hadn't realised they were that early.
They are, I think. I think the B minor, if I remember correctly, is written when he's 14. Possibly
Which is, it's somewhat ridiculous, isn't it? Really?
It's utterly ridiculous. And then a year later, the octet was coming, which is also going ahead on this program. Yeah, so it's fabulous. It's absolutely great writing, but it is very much a vehicle for the pianist.
Is it one of those works that it's almost like a concerto for piano with 3 strings?
Exactly.
Yeah. There are occasionally works like that. I think the Mozart Piano and Wind quintet is very much of that ilk as well. The spotlight's very much on the piano.
Yes, that's right. And you get that more in the 19th century chamber music repertoire, piano and strings. You get that more with the quintets, I find, than the quartets, where a string quartet together form a kind of mini ensemble of their own, which is joined by the pianist.
A bit us and them between the
this
quartet and piano.
squaring off of the piano and the strings.
Yeah.
Whereas in the quartets, each line and the strings tends to be a little bit more of an individual. But in the case of the Mendelssohn, it's very much piano front and center. It's a spectacular work.
My feeling about piano quartets, just from what I know of the repertoire, compared to quintets, is that piano quartets seem to have been written, at least earlier in the 19th century and certainly in the later 18th century, more as domestic works, whereas quintets seem to have a sort of a concert aura about them. I don't know whether that's a fair distinction to make. But,
the quartet repertoire is generally less played. There are a lot of really wonderful works, but they're not as famous as your Schumann quintet or your Brahms quintet. Shostakovich. The piano quartet. Brahms wrote 3 piano quartets, and there's some of his finest chamber music. Absolutely beautiful, and they're large-scale symphonic works. You have 2 by Fauré. You have Schumann, of course, which is like a companion piece to his piano quintet. They're written at the same time.
But as you list them, you're right.
I know what you mean. I think they're rarely played, and they're generally, it is generalization, but there tends to be a bit more of an intimate character about them, I suppose.
What about Suk? I mean, there's a composer we don't hear very often, and you're involved in his piano quartet.
Indeed, and that is a work that's new to me. So I'm very interested to explore it.
And he's a composer we tend to sort of lose between, say, Dvorak and Janacek in the Bohemian composers, and yet occasionally some of his works pop out. There was the Azrael Symphony. I remember hearing the Melbourne Symphony play many years ago, and it was an eye-opener. And I thought, here's a composer that we shouldn't forget,
Yes.
because so it'll be wonderful to hear that piano quartet, which is completely unknown to me. I've never heard it.
Yes, yeah. Well, as you say, it's one of the great things about chamber music festivals, that they provide this platform to mix and match works in an interesting, thematically coherent way. And that concert that you're talking about, of course, is an Opus 1 concert.
Ah, right.
About not so inauspicious beginnings.
Well, yes.
So we have a piano trio by Beethoven and the piano quartet of Suk on the same program, both Opus 1.
Now, you mentioned the Schumann piano quartet, and again, as you say, it's not played as much as the quintet, but it is a marvellous work, and you're playing that, I think, twice on the Friday.
Yes, possibly 3 times, because it's also the subject of the concert conversations that day. So
and Howard Penny is taking us
discussing.
Through.
Yes, exactly. And then we have 2 performances later in the day. And that's something that makes me very, very happy, because it's one of my favorite pieces of music.
Yeah.
And I've got such lovely colleagues to play it with.
Well, yes, and I think that's one of the things. It's given all the coronavirus issues and all of that, which we don't need to tell anybody about. The sad thing about this festival is that the involvement of the musicians from the Chamber Orchestra of Europe can't go ahead. But the wonderful thing is that it's opened the doors to so many more of your Australian colleagues being involved.
Exactly. Yeah, it will have a different feel about it this year, as opposed to the inaugural festival just a year ago. Oh my goodness, it feels longer than that.
It certainly does.
When you were saying 2020, I was thinking, no, he's got that wrong.
I had to think as I was saying it, to be honest, yeah.
It was one of the last live concerts that I did before the world turned upside down.
Yeah, indeed.
It will feel different, but many positives, and there's such a lovely camaraderie in a situation like this where we're able to come together, Australian artists, for something like this, and I expect it won't be the only festival next year where that is the case.
And one of the things about a festival like this that goes over 3 or 4 days is that it's not just you meet, do a concert and go. you've actually got just that little bit longer to spend, and it becomes 4 days doesn't sound terribly long, but it is more settled than perhaps you would normally get for a one-off gig, in another context.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, of course, most of us performing know each other already. Many of us have worked together in different combinations. So we're not necessarily meeting fresh for the first time, and we have a period of rehearsal ahead of the festival.
I wanted to ask you about that. What sort of, it must be very difficult to rehearse, just looking at all of the works on the list here, to be performed in such a concentrated period of time. What sort of rehearsal schedule are you able to have under these sorts of circumstances?
Yeah, it's a marvel of organisation. How the festival directors managed to put together this matrix where the same people are involved in so many different combinations of each other. How do you optimize time to be able to rehearse works where all players can be in one room at the same time? But they manage, and to be honest, on quite a tight schedule. I believe we have 3.5 days perhaps altogether in Melbourne before we head to Bendigo.
Which is
to put
not
together
long.
15 concerts work.
It's not long, no.
It's not, but that's the name of the game, and it's more than you encounter in some festivals. I recall there's always the Australian Festival of Chamber Music in Townsville as being notorious for the punishing rehearsal schedule, a bit of a larger festival that runs over 9 days, with a lot going on in multiple venues, and you just find yourself absolutely battered and on stage often with minimal time, which does something to create that camaraderie as well. We're all in it together, and the audiences can feel the excitement and the electricity that engenders.
And I think it's important for us as audience members to remember that, before you enter those, 3.5 days or whatever of rehearsals before you go to Bendigo, you have to have all that music in your head and under your fingers and worked out even before you get there. I mean, there's a lot of preparation you are doing, I assume now, and have been doing for quite some time on all of this, not to mention everything else that you do.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, which, that's what we do. Music is a time-consuming endeavor, and you find, after having been in the world of music for some decades and clocked up a few tens of thousands of hours of practice, that you have hours in the bank, of course, that you can draw on, and repertoire that you've learned, and you become more efficient at it. But nonetheless, there is an awful lot of work that goes on. That's right, before we even have the first rehearsals.
Now, moving on through the schedule for the festival, you're then doing a recital with wonderful Australian soprano Jacqueline Porter. That's, again, going to show you in a different light.
Indeed, yeah. And we've devised a very beautiful program which has just come together, in fact, so I'm not even sure that it's on the website at this stage.
I haven't seen it. Can you give us any hints as to what you're playing?
Well, there will be it's a program of Lieder in the German language, but not exclusively by German composers. So we have works by Schubert, of course, as the father of song, and some Mendelssohn, and then a set by Grieg.
Wonderful.
Six Lieders, which are based on German poetry by Heinrich Heine.
That'll be a lovely program. And Jacqueline is a singer I've worked with a number of times myself, and she always brings not just, it's a beautiful voice, but not just that, but there is always a lovely sort of warmth and a really beautiful connection with the audience when she performs.
Yeah. And great finesse.
Yes.
I've worked with Jacqueline only once before. We were part of a recording project 2 years back now for a disc which was recently released on ABC Classic, vocal ensemble works of Schumann and Brahms.
How wonderful. Oh, that'll be wonderful.
It's a great pleasure.
Now, after having played 3 quartets, you then involved in the Beethoven clarinet trio, the so-called Gassenhauer trio on the Saturday.
Indeed. Well, I was to be involved in the Beethoven Gassenhauer trio.
Oh.
And then as a result, purely of that rehearsal matrix that we were just discussing, it became impossible to, the whole rehearsal schedule would unravel because the wrong pianist was in the wrong work.
It's amazing how one little chink in the armour can make other things.
That's it. It just wasn't possible to find the hours to rehearse all of the works.
So will Andrea Lamb be involved in that one?
So Andrea, the other pianist on board, will be performing in the Beethoven, and I will be playing in the Shepherd on the Rock.
Oh, wonderful!
And we did a swap.
Wonderful. So you still get to perform with David.
With David, yes, I do. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, in the farewell concert, I see that you're involved in some music by Gershwin and Schubert, if I've got that correct.
Just the Schubert, my knowledge.
Oh, right, not the Gershwin Preludes.
The Gershwin Preludes is Andrea.
Aha, yes. Fine.
Yeah.
So you're playing the Lebensstürmer.
Lebensstürmer with Andrea, yes.
Yeah.
So one of Schubert's many works for piano four hands.
And that's I don't think I've ever seen you play piano four hands. That will be a first for me. Is that something you get to do very often?
It is something that I've done a bit of. Something that I do enjoy a lot. I've had a number of projects with Ian Munro over recent years, and also with Timothy Young at the Australian National Academy of Music.
Not being a pianist myself, that must be a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yes.
Particularly negotiating when the hands are getting close and who goes where and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly. Who goes under, who goes over.
And who
you
pedals?
Find yourself using unconventional fingering, knocking elbows, and yes, it's. I mean, the piano duet developed as primary means of domestic music making, and for that reason, so much great music was written, and it's quite different from music for two pianos, one pianist at each piano. Also, just aesthetically, we were talking about piano quartets versus piano quintets. Well, much more so in two pianos versus four hands, you find that the four-hand music tends to be much more intimate and domestic, whereas the big concert suites are written for two pianos. And I found myself in an interesting situation a couple of months ago where I was to play the famous Fantasy in F minor by Schubert in a concert in Brisbane, and we had come out of our lockdown period and social distancing restrictions were easing, but it still wasn't the right thing to do, to be sitting demonstratively at a piano together. So yes, we're thinking, well, what do we do? Do we play the same work at two pianos? And I just couldn't reconcile myself to the idea of playing such intimate music so distanced, at such a distance. And so we actually reprogrammed a different work which we could play at two pianos.
The social distancing aspect of piano duet playing is not something I had ever considered, but of course.
It's an impossibility.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah. And working within an educational context where we've been extremely cautious in re-entering the rehearsal space and the concert space about how that's done, and that stands were not shared and seats were not shared, and there was 2 meters between players and so on and so forth. How can you possibly be touching the same keyboard, never mind knocking elbows?
Exactly. The things that you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's wonderful. Daniel, it's been wonderful to be able to talk to you about next month's festival in Bendigo. Looking forward so much to seeing you there. I'll be there with a tour party, as I was last year. And
fantastic.
Wish you all the best and great music making.
Thank you so much, Graham. I'm really looking forward to it as well. It should be a great festival.